Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Hellblazer Volume 6, Bloodlines. Now, this collects issues 47 through 61 of the horror/dark fantasy comic book series Hellblazer from DC Comics, later put out by DC's imprint Vertigo. Now, Vertigo was discontinued in 2018, so any new reprintings of these comics would probably be put out by DC's Black Label, which has taken the place of Vertigo, which is what DC now uses to publish their more adult-oriented comics. Now, the issues collected in this volume were originally published between the years 1991 and 1993, and were primarily written by Garth Ennis. However, there's one issue in here written by John Smith. Now, I already reviewed the first 5 volumes of this series, and I'll leave links in the description below to where you could check out those reviews. Now, these comics feature the character of John Constantine, or Constantine, depending on how you want to pronounce it, who is sort of a paranormal investigator / demon hunter / modern day wizard. Now, this character was originally created by Alan Moore, Stephen Bissett, and John Tolibin, and first appeared as a reoccurring character in Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing, but the character proved popular enough to eventually get his own spin-off series. Now, Jamie Delano wrote the first few story arcs of Hellblazer, but his run ended with issue 40, and starting with issue 41, which kicked off the Dangerous Habits story arc, Garth Ennis took over as the head writer of this series. Now, before I talk about the issues collected in Volume 6, I do want to give a little recap of what happened during the Dangerous Habits storyline. Now, in Dangerous Habits, Constantine found out he was dying of terminal lung cancer, so desperate to hold back death for as long as humanly possible, he went to go see a friend of his who also practices black magic, to see if this friend maybe has some kind of spell that could potentially cure his cancer, but he goes to his friend only to find out that his friend is also dying. Now, it turns out this friend of his also made a deal with the devil several years earlier, and on the night he dies, Satan comes to collect his soul, but Constantine finds a way to trick the devil and save his friend's soul, but in the process, basically makes himself #1 on Satan's shit list. Now, the devil in the story is actually a fallen angel known as the First of the Fallen, who is basically what we would call the devil, but he's not actually Lucifer himself. You actually find out in one of the issues collected in Volume 6 that he was an angel who was cast out before Lucifer, hence his title, the First of the Fallen. Major spoilers ahead. Now, Dangerous Habits ended with Constantine basically at death's door because of the cancer, and in an act of desperation, he ended up summoning 2 other demons that are just as powerful as the First of the Fallen, and he promised his soul to both of them. Then he attempted suicide, which brought out the First of the Fallen, who was eager to collect his soul, but the first was shocked to discover that there were these 2 other demons who have also laid claim to Constantine's soul. And basically the dilemma that Constantine traps these 3 demons in is if he dies now, they will have no choice but to go to war over his soul, and if that happens, it could tear hell apart, and then God would inevitably intervene, and the First of the Fallen knows that he stands no chance against heaven's armies. So, the story ended with the 3 demons begrudgingly curing John of his cancer, and then afterwards he flips them all off, which is one of the most defining moments of the John Constantine character. So throughout Volume 6, Constantine now has a new lease on life, and he's dating this woman named Kit, who is actually the ex-girlfriend of the friend of his who originally made the deal with the First of the Fallen, and he's kind of trying to live a normal life now, but little things throughout this volume keep bringing him back to this world of the supernatural, and as all this is going on, you realize that the First of the Fallen is still plotting his downfall, and Constantine is aware of this and is trying to prepare for it. So, the first two issues collected in this volume are issue 47, The Pub Where I Was Born, and issue 48, Love Kills, and these tell a two-part Hellblazer story. Part 1 of this story, The Pub Where I Was Born, was illustrated by William Simpson, and Part 2 of the story, Love Kills, was illustrated by Mike Hoffman. Set some time after the events of Dangerous Habits, we follow this pub that Constantine frequents, run by this kindly older woman, who we learn was actually born in the pub. She was born during World War II when Germany was bombing the shit out of England, and her mother went into labor with her while taking shelter in this pub. And of course, when she became an adult, she eventually became the owner of this pub and ran it with her husband for a number of years. We learn that her husband died a few years prior to the events of this story, but it turns out his spirit has been watching over her. So this pub is a really important part of this woman's life, but it turns out there's this corrupt businessman who wants to buy the property that the pub is on, and he gets involved with some really shady people, and they send some thugs after her to rough her up and burn the pub down, and being unable to live without the place, she ends up throwing herself into the fire and dying, and then she joins her husband in the afterlife, but instead of moving on to heaven or hell, they decide that they're going to take revenge on the people who did this to her. And when Constantine becomes aware of this, he tries to stop them, not because he thinks the people who killed her don't deserve it, but because he knows that God can be cruel sometimes, and he knows if they take this revenge, there's a real risk of them being damned to hell. But these two issues tell a really sad and tragic story, and I like how by the end, we don't really know for sure what the final fate of this old couple is in the afterlife, whether they do go to heaven or hell, and you almost get a sense that to them it doesn't really matter where they go. What matters is that there's some kind of justice enacted for what was done to them, and more importantly, what was done to this pub that was such an important part of their lives and a part of their legacy. And the revenge that the ghosts take on the people who destroyed the pub is some pure body horror shit. Issue 49 is a standalone Hellblazer story called Lord of the Dance, this one being illustrated by Steve Dillon. This one is set presumably sometime after the events of the last two issues, and it's around Christmas time, and Constantine is looking for a gift for his girlfriend Kit, and as he's wandering the streets, he comes across this huge, hulking man who just looks depressed as all fuck, and Constantine immediately realizes that this is not a man, but is actually some kind of an ancient god or spirit in the form of a man. Basically, he's the pagan god of dancing and celebrations, and he's depressed because all the people who once worshipped him are long dead, and he feels that the world has forgotten him, and Constantine basically has to show him, look, people still fucking party. It might not necessarily be a religious practice anymore, but he could still live on through people, through celebrations. And a lot of the story is really a commentary on how Christianity over the centuries has wiped out a lot of these older belief systems by forcing people to convert, and a lot of Hellblazer does focus on that clash between Christianity and older religions and how one is no less valid than the other. And even though this is a universe where the Judeo-Christian God does exist and is apparently the god that created the universe, the gods of other belief systems also exist in this universe, and they're no less valid than the Judeo-Christian god, and ultimately it's all a matter of belief. Regardless of who is the god that actually created the universe or not, it all depends on really which god do you personally hold up as the one true god. That's kind of the commentary that a lot of the Hellblazer comics touch upon, and this also kind of directly ties into Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, which is in the same universe and touches on a lot of these same themes, and regardless of whether these gods existed before mankind or not, a lot of them have come to depend on our beliefs in them, and it turns out that when people stop believing in a god, that god is kind of forced to become mortal or die. Next up is Hellblazer issue 50, Remarkable Lives, and this one was once again illustrated by William Simpson. And basically, in this issue, Constantine, in the middle of the night, finds a dead animal in the bathroom sink of his girlfriend's apartment, and in the mirror, written in blood, is a message clearly addressed to him. So he goes out into the middle of the woods and is greeted by a group of vampires led by one who claims to be the king of the vampires and the first vampire in existence, a being that is implied to be millions of years old. Like, at one point he says he was there when humans first evolved on this planet, meaning that he was never human to begin with. And basically, throughout the issue, the Vampire King is trying to get John to become his right-hand man and promises to destroy Constantine's enemies for him. But the issue basically ends with Constantine telling the Vampire King to fuck off, but in the process makes yet another powerful supernatural enemy that John may have to deal with later on. Next up, we have Hellblazer issue 51, which contains a story called Counting to 10, written by John Smith and illustrated by Sean Phillips. Basically, in this story, Constantine goes to a laundromat one night, and at first things seem normal enough, but as it goes on, both him and we as the audience realize that something is not right about this laundromat or its patrons. Like, there's something off about these people and about the place in general. And there are these older women who talk about a friend of theirs who recently committed suicide, but they insist that she's going to come back and show up at this laundromat at 10 o'clock. That's really all I want to say about this story, but this is a really creepy story. Not just as a Hellblazer comic, but as a standalone horror story. It's very creepy and very Twilight Zone-esque. It's also hinted in this issue that John might be bisexual, which I might have to reread the earlier volumes of Hellblazer, but I don't remember if that was stated or not earlier on in the series. Up next, issues 52 through 55 tell a 4-part story arc called Royal Blood, and dear God, this was an amazing arc. So basically, in the story, somebody who works for the British government, a man named Marston, who knows Constantine and knows about Constantine's dealings in the supernatural, contacts him for help. Now, Constantine does not trust Marston at all, but he reluctantly lets Marston bring him to this private club for Britain's elite. Basically, this club is for British politicians and even some celebrities to blow off steam or relieve some of the stresses of their professions, as Marston puts it. And basically, it's a sex club. Like, there's a lot of orgies that go on there. Not that there's anything wrong with that, as long as it's between consenting adults, but it's implied that there's a lot more going on at this club than just that. Like, it's implied that there's some really sick shit going on here. Now, under normal circumstances, Marston would have never brought somebody like Constantine to this club because this is supposed to be a very private club that Britain's elite wouldn't want the public knowing about. But it turns out some of the patrons at this club, as sort of a party game, apparently read an actual spell to summon a demon, and one of them has become possessed by this demon and is now out there killing people, and killing people in really horrific ways. Like, some of the victims are torn apart, some of them have their faces eaten off, some of them even have their genitals eaten off. But it turns out the reason the British government wants this taken care of as soon as possible is because this person who's possessed is actually a member of the royal family. Now, Now, Constantine has no love for authority and has really no love for the British monarchy, but he's willing to help Marston with this in order to prevent this demon from taking more innocent lives. But as he digs deeper into this, he discovers that there's an even more sinister conspiracy at work. It turns out that there's somebody pulling the strings here, and this is all part of a plot to basically bring England under a complete totalitarian rule by making sure that England's next king is a literal demon. But this was a really good story arc, and it was highly, highly political. The whole story is basically a savage indictment of British politics. Now, I'm from America, so I can't really speak to how accurate or how dead on the satire was. One thing that's pretty cool about this story arc is you find out that this is the same demon that possessed Jack the Ripper. Now, in real life, we never found out who Jack the Ripper was, but there is a conspiracy theory that I think has been largely discredited at this point, but according to the theory, the Jack the Ripper killings were actually orchestrated by the British monarchy as a way to conceal the birth of the illegitimate child of Prince Albert with a prostitute. And according to the theory, Jack the Ripper was actually a physician named William Gull, who was specifically hired by Queen Victoria to commit these murders. Now, in real life, this is just a conspiracy theory that I don't think has a lot of credibility, but Alan Moore used this same theory as the basis for his graphic novel From Hell. And this Hellblazer story touches on that same exact theory, only here we find out that Gull was possessed by a demon, but specifically summoned this demon because he didn't think he had the guts to commit these murders himself. Next up we have Hellblazer issue 56. This is the diary of Danny Drake. And this one was illustrated by David Lloyd, who is perhaps best known as the illustrator of Alan Moore's V for Vendetta. But basically, in this issue, it begins on a train, and this guy is going crazy and is screaming about how he's a whoremonger and his wife left him because of it. And at first, Constantine, who's on the train, thinks this is just a crazy guy until he mentions a book that's used for summoning demons. So Constantine tracks this guy down and gets him to explain himself, and we find out that 10 years earlier, this guy made a deal with a demon called Treskull. I'm not sure if I'm saying the demon's name right, but he sold his soul for financial gain and luck. But it turns out in the years since he's made this deal, his diary has basically gained sentience, and all of his deepest, darkest, most unforgivable secrets he's been screaming out in public. And it also turns out that the demon Treskull is coming for him because his time is almost up. So throughout the issue, Constantine tries to help this guy, but he also feels there's something that Danny is not telling him. This was a really good psychological horror story, and the main character, Danny Drake, at first you feel some sympathy for him, but dear God, as the story goes on and you find out what some of his secrets are, and you find out what he's been doing to keep Treskull off his back, dear God, he becomes very unsympathetic. But even by the end, you still feel some pity for him, maybe just because of how pathetic he is. And while this issue does work as a standalone story, it actually does have some ramifications for later on in the Hellblazer series, because the overarching antagonist of this story, Treskull, becomes a major character a few issues later. So issue 57, Mortal Clay, and issue 58, Body and Soul, tell a two-part Hellblazer story. And both these issues were illustrated by Steve Dillon. Basically, the story arc follows this shadowy organization that is robbing the graves of recently deceased people and using their bodies for ballistic tests, like basically seeing how the human body reacts to different weapons. But because their bodies are being defiled, the spirits of these people are earthbound and are unable to move on to heaven or hell. Now, Constantine and his best friend Chaz Chandler find out about this organization when they find these thugs robbing the grave of Chaz's recently deceased uncle. So Constantine and Chaz try to put a stop to this organization's actions. But this was a pretty good story arc, and the comeuppance of the main villain of this story is, not only is it really satisfying, but it feels like something right out of EC Comics. So, the final 3 issues collected in this volume are Hellblazer issue 59, Guys and Dolls Part 1, Hellblazer issue 60, Guys and Dolls Part 2, and Hellblazer issue 61, She's Buying the Stairway to Heaven, which is basically Part 3 of the Guys and Dolls trilogy. Now, this little story arc also directly ties into issue 56, This is the Diary of Danny Drake, because the overarching antagonist of that story, Treskull, is actually the secondary antagonist of this story arc. But basically, this story arc follows a succubus named Ellie, who we were actually introduced to in the Dangerous Habits storyline, but she frequently visits Earth in human form and is actually allied with Constantine, and it turns out the First of the Fallen wants to use her to get to Constantine, but she refuses, so now him and Treskull, the queen of the succubi, are going after her for daring to defy him. So now Constantine has to figure out a way to hide her from Treskull and the First of the Fallen, but it turns out that Ellie already owed John a favor, because we find out in a flashback in issue 60 how John first met her. It turns out that a long time ago she seduced an angel and actually fell in love with this angel and became pregnant with the angel's child, who would have been an angel/demon hybrid. And both of them knew that if their masters found out about this, they're both dead. Now, I won't give away what exactly happened with this whole storyline, but it didn't end well at all. And it showed that the angels are just as ruthless as the demons. There's also a really badass moment towards the end of the comic where the First of the Fallen and Treskull come to Earth and confront Constantine to try to figure out where Ellie is, and in the scene, Treskull does all the talking, and the First of the Fallen just stares at Constantine the whole scene with a look of pure hate on his face, because the First of the Fallen can't do anything to him, because if Constantine dies, then he'll be forced to go to war with those 2 other demons, and again, it could tear hell apart, and as Constantine says, if he does him in, he'll be eating shit for all eternity. And the whole scene is just Constantine rubbing it in the devil's face, and it's just a freaking badass moment. And this story arc expands a little bit more on the lore, where you find out when the angel Lucifer was cast out of heaven after his failed rebellion, there was already somebody in hell waiting for him. It turns out the First of the Fallen was actually the first angel, who was cast out eons before Lucifer's time. Now, as I pointed out before, Hellblazer is actually in the same universe as Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, and there's a major story arc in the Sandman series where Lucifer is actually sick of being the devil, and as the ultimate fuck you to God, he basically quits being the devil and quits being the ruler of hell. But a lot of this ties directly into that story arc in Sandman where it's implied that Lucifer was the one thing keeping the First of the Fallen at bay, and now that Lucifer has abandoned hell, there's now nobody to hold the First of the Fallen's leash. So yeah, that was my review of Hellblazer Volume 6, Bloodlines. This has some really good story arcs in here, especially the Royal Blood storyline and the Guys and Dolls storyline, and This is the Diary of Danny Drake. Honestly, some top-notch horror comics. But yeah, that was my review, and bye.